The government has confirmed that thousands of victims of the infected blood scandal will receive interim compensation payments of £100,000 each. That's in line with a recommendation made last month by the chairman of the public inquiry, which looked at the supplying by the NHS of contaminated blood to patients in the 1970s and 80s. This report from our health editor, Hugh Pym.
Victims and their families have campaigned for decades for compensation for loss of earnings and the blight to their lives caused by treatment with contaminated blood products. Imports of the products, sometimes derived from paid blood donors, caused thousands of haemophiliacs and others to be infected with HIV and hepatitis C. Subsistence payments were made by the government, but there was no acceptance of liability. In a highly significant move, that's now changed, with an agreement to pay interim compensation of £100,000. At the end of the public inquiry expected next year, there are likely to be further payments.
The time is 6:10. Some of the victims of the infected blood scandal will now get interim compensation payments of £100,000 each. Simon Deadman is our health correspondent. How's this going to work, Simon?
Well, it's going to be paid out by the end of October in England. The same amount of money will also be sent to more than 4,000 victims across the UK. Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, the devolved administrations there will make the payments. This is something that campaigners have been fighting for decades, and this is the first time that the government has offered compensation. Many have been receiving support payments during this time, but not anything for the loss to their lives, for many, the inability to have children, the inability to work, to actually receive financial support for that. This is certainly a historic moment.
We'll be hearing from someone who's been affected her whole life because of this. But there is this question, isn't there, about who constitutes as a victim for the purposes of this? Because if, for example, you were bereaved, even someone who was orphaned, where both the parents died because of this, as I understand it, you're not in line for a compensation payment at the moment.
That's absolutely right. This money will be going to those who are suffering because they've ended up contracting HIV, hepatitis C, or both, or their bereaved partners. Around 4,000 people. 2,500 people have died since this scandal that's begun since the 1970s and lasted throughout the 1980s. But for children who lost parents and for parents who lost children, they are not included in this support. So whilst campaigners have welcomed this money for around 4,000 victims of this scandal, the biggest treatment scandal in the NHS's history, there are now calls for these other people affected by the blood treatment scandal to receive money, and there'll be hope that this will happen, especially as this is the interim payment that the government has referred to, and it's believed there will potentially be more once the blood inquiry finishes, which it's expected to conclude next year.
Simon Deadman, thank you. It has been a long process to investigate how people treated by the NHS were infected with conditions like hepatitis and HIV through blood transfusions or blood products, and the process is continuing through the official inquiry. But thanks to separate work on a compensation framework, some victims will now receive £100,000 interim payments. Ros Cooper is one victim. She's spoken to us before about getting hepatitis C in childhood through transfusions given because she was diagnosed with a bleeding disorder when she was 8 months old in 1975, and she joins us now. Good morning, Ros.
Good morning.
Thanks for talking to us again. Have you received any official notification that you are one of those who will now be compensated?
No, not as yet. I've read the press release.
And it looks from that you are in line, does it not?
Yes, I meet the criteria because I'm already registered with the existing support scheme in England. So yes.
How does it make you feel?
I have mixed emotions this morning. I obviously only kind of read it in the middle of the night, and whilst on one hand I feel the significance of this, because effectively, they are the government are going to pay interim compensation payments, which suggests that they're accepting liability for everything that happened to us, and that's a positive step in the right direction. I feel like it's the start of a process. I feel like there's still so much to do. I feel incredible guilt for the people that I know that haven't been included in this. I met children at hospital when I was getting treatment, and they were also getting treatment. My mum and dad knew their parents. They lost their child, and they haven't had any of their pain or loss recognised so far. So it's important that this is recognised for the achievement that it is, for all the years that campaigners who are alive and no longer with us, all the work that they've put in, and also the work of the inquiry that's ongoing. But it's also important to note that this isn't completion. This isn't over. There's a lot of people who still need to have their suffering recognised.
We're going to talk about them in just a moment, Ros.
Yeah.
Some people will have heard you talk about your own experience before, but not everyone. What was the effect on your life of being infected with hepatitis C in this way?
I didn't know for the first 19 years of my life that was the case. When I found out at the age of 19, I was just going off to university, and it kind of, knowing took my future away, because I knew there was a distinct possibility I would die. But then I continued to live whilst watching friends of mine die from liver failure and from HIV. And it's affected everything. It's affected my physical health. It's affected my mental health. I've had, I was unable to continue working. I was an IT manager, and I had to give that job up. I've been unable to have children because the treatment for the hepatitis C rendered me infertile. It's affected my marriage. It's affected my parents. It's affected my brother. And it's still affected me now. Even though I'm in a fortunate position in that I've cleared the hepatitis C, there's still a possibility that the damage to my liver is such that I will develop liver cancer. That's happened to friends of mine, and I'm not being monitored at this moment for that. So that's a fear I have, a very real fear for the future.
Ros, thank you.
And I'm now on my own. So.
Yeah, thank you very much for talking to us again. Listening to you in the studio, Sir Robert Francis QC, who did the independent study for the government on options for compensation. That laid the groundwork for today's announcement. It was published back in June. Morning, Sir Robert.
Good morning.
Now, this announcement is different. It is less than what was in your report on the recommendations on who should be compensated.
Well, what's been announced today is in effect an interim measure. One of my recommendations was that there were so many people who are living literally in the shadow of death, who may die any moment, who want to settle their affairs before they die. And it was that group that it seemed to me needed an interim payment as a matter of considerable urgency, and I'm glad to see the government has accepted that. I made much wider recommendations covering many of the people that Ros has just talked about. But setting up a compensation scheme of this nature is extremely complicated. And my aim was to make recommendations which in the end would turn out something which is simpler than people having to go to lawyers and go to court and spend more years trying to get what they consider to be justice.
So is it your hope that in time the people, Ros referred to parents who've lost children, but there are also children who lost their parents. There are people who were orphaned where both of their parents died after being infected with it.
My recommendations include making eligible for compensation people who have been dependent on people who've lost their lives. So that would include children, and parents of children will also be covered. One of the things that's often forgotten in this is the devastating effect these diseases have had on those who are close to the person who is infected. And in particular, latterly, in perhaps more in the past than now, the social stigma and the isolation that HIV and hepatitis C had on people, and it's ruined whole families' lives in a way which is quite shocking.
So siblings, for example?
Yes, I've heard stories from siblings who were victimised at school because their brother or sister had HIV or hepatitis. The effect of living with people who are that ill and who may die is, of course, in itself a terrible experience.
It is something that continued for such a long time.
Decades.
Which is extraordinary, thinking about it. And what was it like for you hearing these stories of pain and suffering one after another?
It was profoundly affecting and distressing, but obviously not as much for me as to those who are suffering.
But were you shocked?
I was shocked, and I was shocked not only about the illnesses they suffered, but the fact that the treatment was often caused further suffering, and also the loss of autonomy. Many of these people feel, rightly or wrongly, that things were done to them without their consent or knowledge, and they were never told of much, and Ros has told you some of that.
Have you been told by the government that all of your recommendations will in time be implemented? So all of those you said will be should be compensated, will be?
No, I've not been told that. They are considering the matter. They've said rightly that it's very complex, and they really have to some extent, wait Sir Brian Langstaff's recommendations from his inquiry, because what I did was, in effect, feeding into that inquiry options for him to consider.
Sir Robert Francis, QC, thank you. 12 minutes to 9. Mixed emotions was the way one infected blood victim described her feelings to us earlier. She does fit the criteria for the £100,000 interim payments the government has announced, but she's thinking of others who she was treated with who have died and whose families are not at the moment in line. Kit Malthouse, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, is the minister dealing with the payments. I asked him about the long and difficult road the victims have been on.
It has been terribly tough for people over the last 4 decades, and some of the stories that I've read as part of my work over the last month or so have been really heartbreaking. It's had a massive and profound impact on far too many people, and so when the recommendation became clear that we should be making these interim payments, it was critical that we did so as quickly as possible.
Will you be adopting all of Sir Robert Francis's recommendations on compensation?
So obviously we've taken on board the interim recommendations. So Brian Langstaff, following Sir Robert's testimony to him in the inquiry, made this recommendation that we should make a payment to those who are infected and the bereaved partners, which we will do by the end of October. Obviously, Sir Robert created a wider framework for the payment of compensation, and when the overall inquiry concludes, which will be next year, then we'll be able to do that work to look at what is recommended by the inquiry in the light of the compensation framework and see what more we can do.
I would just wonder how much confidence people who lost children, people whose siblings were infected, people who lost parents and were orphaned because they both died after being infected with contaminated blood, how much confidence they can have that there is compensation coming for them?
Well, we're obviously very conscious that the impact of this scandal was much wider than just those who are receiving interim payments at the moment. And certainly when Sir Brian Langstaff made his remarks about his recommendations, he recognised the disappointment in those wider groups who have perhaps more complex eligibility. When we get to the end of the inquiry, as I say, there will be more work to do to consider what he concludes and how that will fit into the framework of compensation. But look, just having the framework, the Robert Francis report recognises that compensation is likely to be paid on a wider group. And obviously that work will be done as swiftly as possible as soon as the inquiry concludes.